Australia's facing a crippling housing shortage. No obvious solution is apparent. Maybe we should be looking at what Canada's doing. Canada's sharp drop in immigration is delivering significant relief in its rental market. The results raise serious questions for Australia's approach to housing policy. Macro Business Chief Economist Leith Van Onselen joins us now. Leith, good morning to you. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, g'day, Graeme. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thanks. Is there a lesson to be learned from Canada?
Absolutely, and I'd also add New Zealand for that matter. So in Canada experienced an unprecedented immigration boom after the pandemic, similar to Australia, but actually even worse. So their population peaked at about 1.2 million population growth in the 2023-24 financial year. And what they did, that drove record rental vacancies to all-time lows and pushed rental inflation to all-time highs, similar to what we saw in Australia. And the National Bank of Canada, which is one of their major banks, estimated last month that the nation's shortage of rental housing now exceeds 450,000. So what the Canadian government did in response, last year they implemented a 3-year population freeze, which is also an immigration freeze, obviously. And it's actually proven very effective. So what's happened is Canada's population growth has basically slowed to about zero. So in the fourth quarter of last year, it fell. The population growth slowed dramatically, and then in the first quarter of this year, it was effectively zero. And what Canada is now finding is that the rental crisis has eased massively, and it's actually experienced 8 consecutive months of declining rental prices. So rents are actually falling now, and rents are down about 3.5% over the year. And also house prices have been falling as well. So from an affordability perspective, Canada is improving, and it's a similar story across the pond in New Zealand, whereby their net overseas migration has fallen to a 2.5-year low, and their rents are also falling, and their house prices have also fallen, once you adjust for inflation, back to sort of late 2019 pre-pandemic levels. So both nations sort of show Australia that the optimal solution when you've got a housing shortage is to stop pumping demand by importing hundreds of thousands of new overseas migrants who need housing.
We had runaway inflation, not inflation, well, that too, but runaway immigration in Australia for numerous years, pumping 1 million or so more people into the country. But hasn't the federal government capped migration?
Yeah, so what they've said is they want to basically halve immigration from the boom, but that's still historically high. So in the last 12-month period, Australia's population grew by 446,000, which is basically a Canberra. So you just imagine cutting and pasting a Canberra into Australia. That's basically what we did. And that was off net overseas migration of about 341,000. Now, to put that into perspective, while immigration's fallen from about 560,000 at the peak, that 341,000 that we recorded last year is still higher than anything in Australia's history before the pandemic. So it's still historically high. And in fact, the federal government's own population forecasts predict that Australia's population is going to grow by 13.5 million people in the next 40 years. So that is equivalent to adding another Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane to Australia's current population in just 40 years. Now,
wow.
to put that into perspective, it took Australia 170 years to get to 13.5 million people in the mid-70s, and we're expected to add 13.5 million people in the next 40 years. So again, if you just visualise everybody living in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane and all the houses and infrastructure that are involved with those three cities, you'd have to replicate that in 40 years to ensure that the housing situation doesn't get worse.
Wow.
And that's obviously an impossible task to replicate those three cities in 40 years.
Well, the government has, and the federal and state governments have grand plans to inject more houses into the system. But even what they're projected, they're falling well behind. So, we're never going to catch up.
That's right. So the federal government's own National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, so that's their advisory body, they released a report last month looking at the next 5 years, which is basically the federal government's housing targets, which they've set a target of building 1.2 million homes over 5 years. And what they said is that Australia is going to fall short by about 265,000. South Australia is going to fall short by about 29%, which equates to about 25,000 homes.
Yeah.
And because of that, they've basically taken the federal government's population forecast, which is proxy for immigration, applied it against their own housing supply estimates. And what they've said is that Australia's housing shortage is going to worsen by another 79,000 over the next 5 years. But here's the thing, Graeme. In their sensitivity analysis at the back of the report, they actually estimate that if population growth was just 15% less than what the federal government forecasts, then instead of having a 79,000 shortfall of housing over the next 5 years, we actually have a surplus of 40,000. So what that tells you is that But if you want to solve the housing crisis and the housing shortage, the optimal solution, the easiest solution, the fastest solution is to simply cut net overseas migration, stop importing hundreds of thousands of people into the country every single year who need housing. And if you just did that, you literally solve the housing shortage.
When you put it that way, Leith, I mean, it is patently obvious. Why haven't the government seen this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, the government policymakers, other policymakers like the states and the housing industry, they always paint this problem as a supply issue, when really it's a demand issue. So Australia's population has grown by 8.7 million people so far this century. So that's less than 25 years in the data. And that is a 46% increase in the nation's population growth. Now, that is the fastest population growth in the developed world Australia's experienced in the last, so far this century. So if you're going to add 46% to your population in less than 25 years, 46% growth, obviously you're going to create shortages of housing, shortages of infrastructure, shortages of energy, water supplies, everything. And that's effectively what Australia's done. And that is the fundamental reason why we have not been able to supply enough homes, because we've run this big Australia mass immigration policy that has just ploughed hundreds of thousands of people, extra people every single year into the country who need housing. None of this is rocket science. And unfortunately, the federal government's own projections project we're going to have another 13.5 million people in the next 40 years because of immigration. So, again, that's another Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane in just 40 years. So obviously this housing crisis is going to be permanent if we continue with the same model.
Well, it seems to be an obvious solution, and Canada is the blueprint. It's not like, hey, this would be a good idea, let's try it. As you've said, Canada is doing it, it's effective. New Zealand's doing it, it's effective. Have you heard any downside? Is there any negative reaction to what Canada's doing?
Oh, yeah. I mean, obviously, you always get the usual quarters, the business lobby, the universities, which obviously make a mint of international students, the housing industry itself, who loves, extra demand every year. And also there's always the cries of racism that you hear. But those are the typical sorts of complaints. Obviously, if you're going to run lower population growth, it means that your economy is not going to grow as fast in a aggregate sense. But it doesn't really matter, because what matters to us is how much growth in income growth and growth in living standards we get per person.
And quality of life.
That's it. So whether the overall economic pie grows is irrelevant if our slice of the pie keeps shrinking. And that's effectively what's happened to Australia in the last, several years. We've actually, while the economy has grown slowly, everyone's slice of the pie has actually gone backwards, because we've had 9 out of 12 quarters of negative per capita growth. So, this whole Big Australia policy, yes, it is good for the economy overall if you just measure it by output, but it's not necessarily good for us per person. And I'd argue that our living standards, especially if we live in one of the big cities, has been degraded quite significantly through lack of infrastructure, lack of housing, poor quality housing, because I live in Melbourne and now, people are being forced to live in shoebox apartments, whereas previous generations could have afforded a house. That is obviously a degradation of your quality of life. It takes longer to drive anywhere now. It's just become a worse place to live effectively. So, unfortunately, if you're going to add another 13.5 million people in the next 40 years, Melbourne's going to grow to 9 million people, which is insane. Sydney, 8.5, Brisbane, roughly the size of Melbourne, and Adelaide, another million or so.
Yeah.
I don't think our quality of life is going to improve.
Well, Leith, you speak so much sense. Are Canberra listening?
I don't think that, unfortunately, Graeme. But again, the official population projections that came out in December said they're going to grow by 13.5 million people in the next 40 years. That's Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane. So that, to me, tells you that they are not listening, because that is the official projection.
Leith, thanks for your time today, shedding light on a subject that concerns us all.
Yeah, thanks, Graeme.
Leith Van Onselen, Chief Economist and Co-founder of Macro Business. What are your thoughts, folks?